is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I offer an amendment now that is being distributed that people will be able to see. I will take up, there's 3 parts to the amendment. I will discuss the first part last. The second part being a rule of construction that is in reference to unaccompanied alien children with respect to what we're amending with TVPRA. I know we will be debating that subject at length later, but this is simply a rule of construction to make sure and clarify certain specific provisions, screening of such a child for a credible fear of return to his or her country of origin, screening of such a child to determine whether he or she was a victim of trafficking. Department of Health and Human Services policy in effect on the date of enactment of this act requiring a home study for such a child if he or she is under 12 years of age. We believe this will help just clarify and ensure the intent of what we're trying to do with provisions relating to unaccompanied alien children, ensuring that they're returned safely to their families. As we currently do under our current law, this is just trying to align that with what we do with Mexico and Canada, for example, and that this is just some clarifying language. The next section, with respect to detention facilities, the issue is the concern has been raised about how much we have with respect to detention, with some concerns about whether or not that means people will not be allowed into the country and be detained for the adjudication of asylum claim. So this language would say that we should return the detention facilities to the level that were in operation in January of 2021, and to ensure, I think, at least another 5,000 beds to ensure that we have sufficient detention facilities to have people housed during the adjudication of a claim. We think that's an important part of this as well, so we're putting that forward. And finally, and most importantly, legislative process works best when we have engaged in thorough conversation. We're having a thorough debate and conversation on our side of the aisle, while unfortunately my colleagues on the other side of the aisle bury their head in the sand and refuse to acknowledge the crisis at the border. So we have been going through making sure we've got language to accomplish the objective that we've had from the beginning, which is to ensure that we no longer release people into the United States contrary to existing law, and in so doing, ensure that we are giving people the ability to have a legitimate claim to asylum for credible fear of persecution for the religious beliefs or political beliefs, that those individuals will be given the ability to have that asylum claim heard, but without allowing this administration continue to abuse the asylum laws and the parole laws, which we'll discuss later, by releasing people into the United States, which is causing the magnet, which is empowering cartels, which is empowering China, which is causing migrants to die, which is causing Americans to die, which is causing fentanyl to come into the United States. And we're seeking to stop that. So we have agreed to strike the section that is in this amendment, which would be the provision that had been a part of H.R. 29. We're maintaining a piece of H.R. 29 that is the part for the required suspension of entry. We believe that we have found a better way to do that to ensure that people have, that the intent of what we are trying to do ensures that individuals will have their asylum claims heard, but that the rule of law will sustain, and that we'll be able to either detain or have expedited removal or have safe third country, or be able to have people await in Mexico and otherwise have their claims to asylum be heard. That is the intent of what we're trying to accomplish. So we are working to do that by offering this amendment to strike that particular section within the draft amendment in the nature of a substitute that everybody has. With that, I would yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? One second. There's a gentlelady from California System.
I'm sorry, this is a long amendment. We're trying to figure it out. I do withdraw my point of order.
Okay. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am in support of the Roy amendment. There should be uniform rules in this country for how unaccompanied children are treated when they come to our border. We shouldn't have a different set of rules for different countries, and unfortunately that confusion is what we see in the system now. The fixes that undergird the philosophy of the Roy Amendment actually have been supported throughout time by both Democrats and Republicans. In 2014, when we had a crisis of unaccompanied children at our border, then President Obama requested that Congress amend the law that created the incentives for children to come to the United States without parents or authorization. And even in 2021, President Biden, when speaking freely and pressed by a reporter, stated that he also thought that an unaccompanied alien child arriving at our border should be sent home to a parent or family member and not be allowed to stay in the United States. But unfortunately, as a matter of policy, the Biden administration has removed key safeguards for security and even background vetting of many of the sponsors of unaccompanied children at the border. I recall vividly a codel that Congressman Biggs led down to the border, where we heard from Border Patrol agents about how at times the same children were being used over and over again in these smuggling operations. I know that's not what any of us want, but while our heartstrings may direct us to the thought that we should allow unaccompanied children into the country, we don't have to guess. We know, as a matter of history, that the consequence of that policy decision is that more unaccompanied children will be sent, and that the United States will be deeper into the human smuggling business. I would finally observe that in these cases, if we change the rules, the gangs notice it too. And you'll see MS-13 and Sinaloa cartel as an enterprise work to try to recruit folks in that 14, 15, 16-year-old range, 17 years old, because they know that they will be paroled into the country absent these fixes. And that will be the new generation of gang talent. 20-year-old Kayla Hamilton was raped and murdered last summer by one of the unaccompanied children who entered the country during the Biden administration and who the secretary lost track of. That unaccompanied child was reportedly a 17-year-old MS-13 gang member. In my state of Florida, there are many patriotic Americans whom, when they think of unaccompanied children, we recall the Pedro Pan flights that brought so many from communist Cuba into the country, and where so many Catholic charities were willing to facilitate adoptions throughout our land. But what we see now is very different. We see a highly sophisticated smuggling ring that will respond to the incentives that we build into the law. When we created incentives in the law that so long as you had a kid with you, that was like a fast pass into the country, that was a way to evade detention, that every time you encountered an adult at that border, they were clinging on to a minor child. And those minor children, sadly, were recycled and abused and tormented, and it was our laws that allowed it. And so I would strongly encourage the adoption of the Roy Amendment, not as a way to spurn our compassion, but as a way to embrace it, as a way to understand that the best place for a child to be is with their parent. And let us not create a pipeline of children into the country with massive strain on our social safety nets, on the systems that we have for American children who are often in need and who often see the services that our government provides diluted by these very incentives and features. I would yield my remaining minute to Mr. Roy if he had anything to add.
Well, I think the gentleman from Florida was the gentleman from Florida here when I introduced two articles from the New York Times into the record that outlined the extent to which children are being abused, sold into the human trafficking slavery business into the United States as we speak, and outlining how 85,000 children had been lost. 85,000 children had just simply been lost by the federal government in all of this compassion oozing out of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Is the gentleman aware of that when I introduced that in the record?
Yeah, and keenly aware of it, and keenly aware that that doesn't happen by accident. That happens as a direct consequence of the choices we make. And so as we endeavor to move this immigration legislation to the floor, I believe that this is one of the most important amendments that we will vote on, one of the most important features of the bill, because it allows us to ensure that we have children with their parents and not on a treacherous journey that results in abuse and exploitation.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I oppose this amendment, but I'm very glad that my Republican colleagues have realized that the bill actually did send all unaccompanied children seeking safety at the border back to Mexico. That's what it did. And your amendment, I think, because we had a number of amendments prepared to see if y'all really cared about children, as you've been saying you do, I think you adjusted that. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. However, the bill is still unworkable and still cruel and inhumane. And I want to give you one example. In your amendment, you call for a number of detention centers to be reopened, including the Irwin Detention Center in Georgia. Well, let me tell you why that detention center was closed. It was actually a resolution that I led in Congress to call for that detention center to be closed because 40 immigrant women had forced non-consensual surgery to sterilize them in that facility by a gynecologist who worked in that facility. It was stunning to see what happened in the Irwin detention facility in Georgia. And that anybody would call for that facility to be reopened, given the history of that, is remarkable to me. And I just want to read you, this is from a New York Times article, September 29th, 2020, one of the testimonies of the women that was in that detention facility that you are now asking to reopen in this amendment. Wendy Dove was startled awake early one morning in January 2019 when guards called her out of her cell block in the Irwin County Immigration Detention Center where she had been held for 4 months. She would be having surgery that day, they said. Still groggy, the 48-year-old immigrant from Jamaica, who had been living without legal status in the United States before she was picked up, felt a swell of dread coming over her. An outside gynecologist who saw patients in immigration custody told her that the menstrual cramping that she had was caused by large cysts and masses that needed to be removed. She was skeptical, but the doctor insisted, and as a detainee brought to the hospital in handcuffs and shackles, she felt pressured to allow him to take her in. It was only after she was deported and had her medical files reviewed by several other doctors that she realized what had happened to her. This is the facility that you want to open? I'm quite stunned by that. But on top of that, you're saying you want to detain families, and we know that detaining families is bad for children. It's bad for families. It has lifelong traumatic consequences. Let me just remind you of what the CDC advises in terms of where kids should be by age 5. Kids should be able to count to 10. They should name numbers between 1 and 5 when you point to them. They should use words about time, like yesterday, tomorrow, morning, or night. How are they going to learn these in family detention centers? That is an inhumane way to go about anything that we need to do. So I would say that this amendment is extremely misguided. It focuses on putting families in detention. We know that that's not humane, and it continues to be completely unworkable. So I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I yield to my colleague, Ms. Scanlon.
I couldn't agree with you more about this. I mean, certainly the Irwin County medical abuse was absolutely horrific, was in all of the newspapers. Everybody agreed it was outrageous. But we also need to note that the other, all 5 of the immigration detention centers listed here were closed because of inhumane conditions and abuse of immigrant families, children, people who were detained not for criminal activity, but detained while they were awaiting processing of their asylum applications. They were in line, they were following the rules, and they were detained in places that were subhuman. So that's why these places were closed, and the suggestion that they should be reopened is absolutely inhumane. I yield back to Ms. Jayapal.
And I yield back.
Lady yields back. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I support the Roy amendment here, and I do find it ironic that the exception provision that requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to find alternative housing. If you don't like these detention facilities, we've given authority to the person who I think is maybe the most incompetent, but the Secretary of Homeland Security, the ability to open up additional facilities to get the equivalency of the beds. I think Secretary Mayorkas should be impeached, but that's just me. But let's just talk about inhumane treatment and cruel. Those are the terms I just heard. You know what's cruel and inhumane is when a cartel that has no consideration of life organizes a party of 21 individuals, including a 5-month-old baby and an 8-month-old baby, and sends them up and drops them off in the middle of the heat in southern, well, in this instance, northern Mexico, which is just across the border a ways, and says, keep walking north. You're going to come to a barbed wire fence because that's all that's there. When you get to the other side of it, just sit down and wait for the Border Patrol agents. They have no idea how long it's going to be. They walk and they walk. Young boy, 10 years old, with Huarache sandals, is walking in the desert, the dirt. Happens to be rattlesnake season in Arizona and northern Mexico. We're going to send them out there, and with the cartel. That's the inhumanity. And right now, Chief Maudlin, the sector chief for the Tucson sector, just issued a warning to all those who are illegally planning or crossing illegally into Arizona. They said, watch out. Watch out, it's over 100 degrees now. The snakes are out. You've got to be careful. And the way they're coming, he said, there's groups of 200, 300, 400 coming, but they spread out. And as they spread out, that's when you have individuals who are left behind who die because of dehydration and the heat. That's inhumane. But you know what drives that? It is the policies of the Biden administration that say if you come in, the group I just saw last Thursday when I was down there, 21 of them, every one of them, were going to ask for asylum. Where are you from? Chiapas. Really? You need asylum from Chiapas? Well, how about you? Where are you from? Zapotec. What are you going to do? We're asking for asylum. Really? How about you? Well, I'm from Merida on the Yucatan. I've been to all those places. I'm telling you. They're coming up there asking for asylum, not because they want asylum per se and because they qualify for asylum, but because this administration has blandished across the world. And the cartels advertise, come there, when you get up there. Who told you to ask for asylum? Well, you know, the coyotes. The coyotes that we paid 75,000 pesos per person to get here. They said, ask for asylum when you get up there. That's what happens. And it's dangerous. And it's driven by this policy. So when I hear terms like cruel and inhumane, I think, well, good grief, come on down with me. I go down all the time. I'll take you down. We'll go see these folks. I'm going to yield now to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
To explain inhumane, it was almost 2 years ago. I was down to the Darien Gap in Panama. What did we see as a result of the pull of migration with the policies that were implemented January 20th of 2021? We heard from villagers in the Darien about babies floating down the Turquesa River. We saw indigenous tribes that their way of life is being destroyed because of the pull of migration going through their communities, and their young people are leaving to deal drugs. Let's talk about the Rio Grande and the bodies that lay on the bottom of that river. Talk to the sheriffs in Arizona. Talk about inhumane when women carry rape kits with them, when they carry birth control with them, because it is likely that these mothers and their female daughters will likely be raped, so they carry birth control with them. You want to talk about inhumanity? Look at the current immigration policies of this administration enacted on January 20th of 2021, when a pipeline of prosperity in America was shut down and the pipeline from Panama was opened up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that we are, as a committee, talking about the inhumanity that migrants have to face. I don't remember any of my Republican colleagues or having an outcry or making any statements about the inhumanity of the prior administration's family separation policy, when children and babies were ripped out of the arms, literally, of their mothers and separated. And in fact, there are hundreds of children that have yet to be reunited with their families because their families cannot be found because the government did not keep track of those families that were separated. And yes, let's talk about the inhumanity of the horrific journey that migrants have to take and what happens when they are expelled. Let me remind my colleagues that those expulsion policies... Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. I'd like to remind my colleagues that under the prior administration, those expulsion policies are exactly what helped initiate the cartel involvement in human trafficking. And by the way, if my Republican colleagues would like to begin to tackle the power of the cartels, it begins by addressing the gun situation. 70% of the guns used by cartels are guns coming from the United States of America. They're guns coming from this country, moving south, and we're effectively arming the cartels. But look, I represent El Paso, Texas. As all of my colleagues know, I'm the only member of Congress who grew up, born, raised, third generation, and represents the U.S.-Mexico border. No one knows better than I do the challenges that come with the refugee crisis, the migration crisis that we are seeing. And no, it did not begin in January of 2020. Every time I hear one of my colleagues claim that this is a result of President Biden, I know how unserious they are. They are either unserious or unwilling to look historically at what our country has been dealing with really for more than a decade. But especially since 2014, we have seen a change and an evolution in migration. More and more vulnerable people, more and more families coming to the border. And yes, it's true, not every one of those migrants qualifies for asylum. I absolutely acknowledge that. But what we have done as a nation is essentially create one line for migrants to get into, just one line. We've basically shut down, curtailed, or greatly limited all other legal pathways. That's on us. That's on Congress. If we were to open up more legal pathways, we could better manage the border. But we all heard what happened when Mr. Massey tried to create an exemption for veterans. His own colleagues were fighting him on that. His own colleagues did not want a legal pathway for veterans. So let's be very, very clear. We are not going to address this with the bill or this amendment, which would essentially jail every family coming to the border. We're not going to address or solve anything this way. And in fact, I would argue that what the United States has been doing for the last 30 years, we've been doing it the Republican way, which is address immigration as a border-only issue. Well, when you address immigration as a border-only issue, you break the border. Yes, the border is broken, but it's broken because we have absolutely been derelict in our responsibility as members of Congress to open up legal pathways and create better management at our border. We have done it because in order to spite migrants, we're willing to basically say we want zero migration. That is fundamentally what is behind this bill. And so I will tell my Republican colleagues, I am absolutely willing, ready, and want to compromise. I want to find a solution. No one more than members of my community want a solution. But it has to be bipartisan, it has to be reasonable, and it cannot be more inhumane. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. Who seeks recognition?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
To strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I yield to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. I appreciate that. I just have to respond just to a couple of things that were said that in the last presentation that I found absolutely startling and amusing. I too grew up, born and raised in a border congressional district. I too spent a lot of time in our beautiful state of Mexico, which is to the south. That is just lovely. I love that place. But let's talk about two things. The dramatic and grossly false narrative that Trump lost thousands of kids. His administration misplaced 3,000 kids, there's no doubt. But you know how many the Biden administration has misplaced? We just had testimony yesterday, 85,000 plus. 85,000 plus. What happened under the Trump administration? They found them. They made them find them. We sat there. We sat in this hearing room, and they came in and gave us regular updates on what they were doing to find and locate those children, reunite them with their families. Golly, I just wonder what we're doing with the 85,000. You know what we got from the secretary yesterday? They're not doing a thing to try and find them. Not doing a thing. And our friends on the other side of the aisle, silence, silence. How about this one? Yeah, you want to work with the cartels, stop the gun trafficking. Do you know who's been advocating for southbound operations? I have. That's how you stop gun trafficking into Mexico. It's how you stop moving and the laundered money into Mexico. You know what we got? We asked for more gun sniffing dogs, more money, cash sniffing dogs. We want them to be southbound operations. You know what they do? They'll do an operation about a week-long operation. Last time I heard of one, they found $1 million cash lining a minivan heading south. $1 million. But instead of those type of dogs, our administration said, we're going to get 30 dogs. They are going to be stress dogs. We're going to place them in these in the sectors, in the facilities, so that when the agents feel stressed, they can go pet a dog. We're not going to give them more personnel. We're not going to give them more operations. We're not going to give them more pay, more security. We're not going to build a fence. We're not going to give them any of that infrastructure. No. Because we're not going to give them that and the morale's bad, we're going to send them a great dog. I think Chappie was the last dog I saw. The one in Tucson is also called Lucy, I think. That's what this administration does. Mr. Bishop, thank you for letting me speak. I'll yield back to you.
I thank the gentleman. I yield to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore.
Mr. Biggs, I want to address the same issue. I don't know if any of our friends have been to Fort Bliss, but when I was out, we went to Fort Bliss, the Emergency Intake Center for Children, Unaccompanied Minors, over 1,000 a day. And they're just taking these kids in, and they're throwing them on buses. I actually tried to video the buses shipping the children all around the country, and they seized my cell phone because they did not want the people to know that we were shipping children all over the globe. And I actually asked,
yield?
No, 1 minute. I actually asked the Admiral on site, I said, Admiral, can you tell me, why do we not send these children back to where they came from? He said, well, sir, we don't know where they came from. I said, but we're going to ship them to a Google address in America. I said, well, do we do background checks on the people we're sending these children to? And he said, oh, no, we don't do that. So we're loading children on a bus, unaccompanied, shipping them to places that, to God knows what, to God knows where. We don't do background checks on the adults we're shipping them to, and now we've lost 85,000 children. I tell you this, a closed border is a compassionate border. Mr. Bishop, I'll yield back, and then he can make that choice, ma'am.
Ms. Garcia, I'll yield to you if you will answer the question how your concern for the 3,000 lost in the Trump administration that were recovered doesn't, and whether you have the same concern for the 85,000 children lost by the Biden administration.
Well, we've got 20 seconds. I'm not Ms. Garcia. Maybe all us Latinas look alike, but I'm Ms. Escobar. I actually represent Fort Bliss. I have been to that intake facility a number of times. My staff goes on a regular basis. I can tell you much of what you have said. I need a little bit more time to debunk, but one of the reasons why they don't let you film children is because we shouldn't be filming children.
Are you back? Time's expired. Who seeks recognition? Ms. Macbeth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm deeply concerned, about the amendment's desire to subject unaccompanied minors to additional screening and require DHS to reopen various detention centers, one, of course, which is in my own backyard in Georgia. And I was really kind of offended by the remarks by my colleague from Florida who says that we should embrace our compassion with this policy. I'm particularly distressed because one of the detention centers this amendment seeks to reopen is Irwin County Detention Center, as I have mentioned, that is in my home state of Georgia. Irwin County Detention Center was specifically shut down because after an 18-month investigation by the Senate, it was found that a gynecologist in the center was performing unnecessary medical procedures on detained migrant women without their consent, and that was expressed before several times. My colleague in the Senate, Chairman John Ossoff, stated that, and I quote, "It's the bipartisan finding of the subcommittee that female detainees in Georgia were subjected by a DHS contracted doctor to excessive, invasive, and often unnecessary gynecological surgeries and procedures with repeated failures to obtain informed medical consent," end quote. This year-long plus investigation focused on off-site consultations and treatment that were provided by this gynecologist to women and cataloged hundreds of procedures and surgeries administered by Mr. Amin between 2017 and 2020. So I find it very absurd to me that the other side would go so out of their way to reopen a detention center that has been so careless with the health and safety of women. And so if we're going to be talking about caring for people, caring for the health and safety of women, of Americans, this is definitely not the way to do it. And I would hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would really listen to the calls and the cries of the American people to be treated with fairness and dignity. And I'd like to yield my time to Representative Job Hall.
Thank you, Representative Macbeth. I just wanted to correct my colleague on, I forget which Republican colleague said this, but somebody said that there are no background checks for unaccompanied children's sponsors, and that's just not true. So you can go to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, you can look at the federal law that requires sponsors who are adults to provide for the child's physical and mental well-being, have not engaged in any activity that would indicate a potential risk to the child, and must pass a background check. So just want to correct the record on that. I yield back to Ms. Macbeth.
I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it just seems to me that the answer to the gentlelady's concern over a rogue gynecologist is to fire the gynecologist. All of the health and safety standards and laws are applicable to the facilities that we are discussing. The Democrats are essentially saying there should be no detention. This seems to be their fallback position on so many crimes, and yes, it is a crime to illegally cross the border. But this bill offers alternatives. Most likely, those coming through Mexico are going to choose to await in Mexico or to await in safe third countries where such agreements have been negotiated. As a practical matter, what this is going to do is eliminate the incentives for millions of fraudulent claims that are being made. as long as we offer automatic admission, free goods and services, indefinite residency, indefinite work authorization, we shouldn't be surprised that millions of people are motivated to file fraudulent claims in order to obtain these benefits. If we end the incentives to file fraudulent claims, we end the fraudulent claims. And on that day, the legitimate asylum claims from those who are genuinely persecuted can again be expeditiously decided. The Democrats just argued that anyone who lives in a communist country has a right to migrate to the United States. Well, I would remind them that is 1.5 billion people. The Trump policies ended the incentives for people to come here by the millions because they knew that they would not be admitted. And under Biden, they know that they will be, and that's why they're coming. The record speaks for itself. Since Biden changed the Trump policies and initiated an unprecedented illegal mass migration, 2,000 migrants, many of them children, have died. We have no idea how many hundreds of thousands were raped, assaulted, robbed, or abandoned by the cartels. We have only a rough idea of how many tens of thousands of children have been abandoned to sweatshops, sexual exploitation, and indentured servitude. We know that there's no locating 85,000 of those that we simply dropped off to so-called sponsors. We know that roughly 1 in 3 calls made to release migrant kids to their sponsors go unanswered. We know that in the last 4 years, ORR released 363,000 children to sponsors, and yet only conducted 25,000 home studies. That's about 7%. 7% is all that we even looked at the conditions we were releasing these kids into. I want to thank Mr. Roy for this amendment that makes crystal clear that every person who wants to claim asylum will be able to do so, but they may not be released into our country until a court says that they have a legal right to be. And I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. So let's talk about ORR and the putative background checks they do. We had the director yesterday in oversight in our subcommittee. There are 4 categories of background of groups that they turn children over to. They don't do any DNA checks to see if somebody is related, if they're really related to that individual. They changed the forms under this director. So they got rid of the actual physical address. They got rid of the actual physical address of the location where they're going to deposit this child. That ain't much of a background check. You know what they're checking? NCIC to see if you've got a criminal history that they can find readily. You don't have to be a legal resident. You don't have to be a citizen. You can be illegally in the country, which means we can't vet you in many, many cases. That is the background check for ORR. And I'll yield back to Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman yield. I want to be brief so don't take too much time, since next week we're going to have hearings on this issue, but this is actually legitimate issues. I went to a number of CADELs last year, including bipartisan CADELs, and it was brought up. Some concerns for people processing children, that their really background checks are not as good as they should be. I have people in my district that actually work in agencies that settle these kids. They have concerns. I have people that have concern with child labor at meatpacking plants, which actually controlled by China on top of it. I think this is a legitimate issue, and we need to make sure that these people and these kids are not going to be put in the arms of criminals. And I think this is a very good amendment to make processes better. And I yield back.
Time has expired. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs. On the amendment offered by the gentleman, Mr. Roy. Those in favor say yes. Opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Gentleman from Kentucky.
I have an amendment at the desk.
It's massive.
Reserve a point of order.
Point of order. Mr. Massey, you're recognized.
I thank the chairman. This amendment's very simple. I won't belabor it. The underlying bill for E-Verify creates a legal framework in which...
Suspend. Clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. McClintock, offered by Mr. Massey of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman now from Kentucky is recognized to explain his amendment. Point of order is reserved by the ranking member.
I thank the chairman. This amendment's simple, and I'll try not to belabor it. Page 113, lines 4 through 10 of the bill, which is the E-Verify section, provide a remedy for individuals who are dismissed wrongly from a job. I think there's an oversight, perhaps, in this bill. It's my presumption that E-Verify is to keep you from getting a job if you're not eligible to work in this country. Now, in the event that a U.S. citizen was deprived their basic fundamental right to work, I think they should still have cause to sue the federal government if the E-Verify system failed them. Now, as I said, the underlying bill provides that if they are dismissed because they wrongly failed an E-Verify background check. But my reading of the bill is that they would have no recourse, legal recourse, if they are initially prevented from being hired for the job. So it's very simple. Page 113, line 6, insert after would not have been dismissed from a job, add this, or would have been hired for a job, but for an error of the verification mechanism. This is just a safeguard, and urge the adoption of this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Oh, that's right.
We do not insist on a point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. Who seeks recognition? All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Who seeks recognition? Or the amendment is adopted. Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. McClintock, offered by Ms. Jayapal, page 66.
Without objection, without objection, the amendment will be
Reserve a point of order.
considered as read. Point of order from the gentleman from is reserved by the gentleman from California. The gentlelady from Washington has 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The power to parole people into this country has been used by the executive branch since President Eisenhower's administration. It has been used to parole in Cubans and Haitians during the Mariel boat lift, as well as for the Filipino World War II veterans and for Hungarians fleeing communism. It is an important humanitarian and foreign policy tool that allows individuals to enter the country more expeditiously in urgent circumstances. This bill, however, decimates the broad parole power traditionally left to the executive branch, and it confines it to far narrower terms. Under this bill, humanitarian parole is limited to cases, 1, involving serious medical emergencies or organ donation to a family member, or where a family member's death is imminent, 2, where an individual is a lawful applicant for adjustment of status, and 3, involving an individual who is lawfully granted asylum or refugee status. Public interest parole is limited to instances in which an individual assisted the U.S. government in a matter such as a criminal investigation, and either the person's presence in the United States is required or the person's life would be threatened if the person was not allowed to enter. Those would literally be the only cases where someone can be paroled under general parole authority. It is an extremely restrictive version of parole, and it would actually preclude the Department of Homeland Security from being able to implement important parole programs that have saved countless lives, like the Uniting for Ukraine or U4U parole program. Following the commencement of Vladimir Putin's unprovoked war of aggression, Ukrainians fled their homeland in droves. Many came to our southwest border seeking shelter in the United States. Understanding the unsustainability of the situation, the Biden administration created a compassionate U4U program, allowing certain Ukrainians on a case-by-case basis to obtain temporary safety in the United States. Border encounters of Ukrainians trying to cross illegally fell from an average of 940 per day before the initiative to only around 12 per day. If the definition of parole under this bill were adopted, these Ukrainians would not have been able to enter the United States. Parole is the most appropriate tool to ensure the safety of this population. Ukrainians who are fleeing from Putin generally are ineligible for asylum because of the narrow grounds for approval. Moreover, the vast majority of Ukrainians are solely seeking a temporary home and wish to return to Ukraine as soon as it is safe for them to do so. Uniting for Ukraine provides them with the temporary protection that they need until they can return home. So my amendment is very simple. It just adds a provision to the parole section of this bill exempting this particular population from the restrictions. I believe that the restrictions on parole authority are an unnecessary overreach into a power that is traditionally reserved for the executive. But since the majority refuses to meaningfully modify the language, I am hopeful that this very narrow exception to protect Ukrainians who are fleeing Vladimir Putin will be acceptable to the majority. I urge my colleagues to accept my amendment, and I yield
Will
back.
the gentlelady yield?
I will.
Thank you. It's very timely. I thank the gentlelady for yielding. We had testimony this morning in the House Foreign Affairs Committee from the special prosecutor in Ukraine, Special Prosecutor Kostin, who spoke about the use of sexual violence, rape, and torture of both children and young women and older women, war crimes committed by the Russians in this military aggression. And so there are literally men and women, but particularly women and children, who are fleeing Ukraine because they are facing unspeakable, horrific war crimes. And he recounted the efforts to collect evidence to be able to prosecute those in an international tribunal as well as under the laws of Ukraine. The idea that we would pass a piece of legislation that would make it impossible for the United States to accept under special circumstances Ukrainians fleeing war crimes, I think would turn what was once regarded as our leadership in the world on refugee and humanitarian efforts to a really embarrassing position. So I thank you profoundly for your excellent amendment. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Rep. Cicilline. I think this is a very simple amendment. It should be accepted by the majority. It is absolutely essential that we continue to support Ukrainians in this dire time of need and that we keep the U4U program going. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California.
Order.
Gentleman from California withdraws his point of order. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So first of all, anyone from the Ukraine that wants to come to the United States can seek asylum. That's simply what they do, is they would seek asylum like anyone else from around the world to be able to get here. So I oppose this amendment. It defeats the very purpose of the bill. We could sit here for hours and propose specific carve-outs for any number of categories of people, and we've been seeing some of that. But that is not what the parole statute was designed to do. It is not what Congress had in mind when it reformed the statute back in 1996. And it is not what this bill seeks to fix. In fact, this amendment is the same type of categorical program that the Biden administration has been illegally pursuing since day one. The parole statute was not designed to be a grab bag of entry authorization for vast, unlimited categories of people around the world. Instead, just as this bill reflects, it is a narrowly tailored authority that applies only in very limited circumstances. This bill is necessary to prevent open borders administrations from continuing to abuse parole to mass release hundreds of thousands of aliens into the United States. The amendment would chip away at these common sense changes. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. And I would go in the way back here, Mr. Chairman. What they said way back then when, at the time of its enactment, Congress intended that the parole authority would be used for the temporary admission of individual aliens in the case of an alien whom the Attorney General has paroled into the United States not for any short-term, time-limited reason, but instead under circumstances that suggest explicitly or implicitly, that the parole will remain in effect indefinitely. Parole status is an unacceptable alternative to a more permanent and defined immigration status. Democrat Representative Bruce Morrison from Connecticut in 1989. You had much the same from Senator Simpson in 1994 from Wyoming. Parole has always meant to be used on a case-by-case basis. This administration has been abusing this authority left and right. We saw it with Afghans that came over after the disastrous withdrawal, when the Biden administration left $85 billion worth of our war-making material and 13 of our finest behind in Afghanistan. Those Afghan refugees that came out were almost all paroled, and they could have been left in a safe third country like Qatar to be able to have their status be evaluated. That's not what the Biden administration did, though. They sent them en masse. And what we're seeing at this point is there's about 1 million people since the Biden administration came into power that have been offered parole to be able to come into this country. That is not what parole is meant to do, and that is what we are doing with this change here, is to make sure parole is being used for the intent that it was originally created for.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentleman from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. So when Secretary Mayorkas came in and testified, you remember he's the one I've mentioned is probably should be removed from his office. But when Secretary Mayorkas came in, and we asked him specifically about parole, he said himself, parole is intended to be a case-by-case, individual-by-individual program. Prior to the Biden administration, the typical number of folks granted parole in a year was 12, maybe 20 at the high. That'd be the high mark. Last year, this administration paroled more than 300,000 people, and they have a program in place to bring in 360,000 paroles, individuals just from 4 nations, Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, and Venezuela. And that would be added to the additional 300,000 that they planned. So they are planning an additional 600,000 plus parolees this year. And when they come in the parole, they get documentation so they can work 2 years, and we won't see them again. That's what this amendment will do. I oppose the amendment, and I'll yield back to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would just close by saying this. You wonder why we're so critical of Secretary Mayorkas. He broke the law. He is, at a minimum, you can say he's violating the intent of the law, but I would say he's breaking the law. Look at the quotes that I just shared with you from representatives from a couple decades ago. He is not following the intent of the law, and that is why we are so critical of him. This closes that. I oppose this amendment, and I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Texas. And then
Mr. Chairman, I strike the last word. As I do so, I'd like to acknowledge my friends, Mr. Chairman, who are in the room from the Texas Farm Bureau, and I'm delighted they're here and hope to be able to speak with them. Raise your hands or let us see you. My goodness, I'm even more excited.
You're welcome.
More excited. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that courtesy. Let me just take issue with pronouncing that a public servant, the Secretary of Homeland Security, has broken the law. I think there are many things that members of Congress can say about fellow public servants, but if my good friend cannot point to a conviction, let us at least accept that public servants try to do what is right within their framework of their jurisdiction or their philosophy. And since I just met with Secretary Mayorkas this morning, I view him as a man of integrity. Having been engaged with Ukrainians in Houston, many of us know that Ukrainians have come to many states, and Texas has opened its arms to those fleeing persecution and the chaos of war. Having been to the region and spoken to Ukrainians, and as well in meetings and briefings on the chaotic and desperate situation. Many of us having viewed little children sitting in streets by their dead moms and dads, elderly persons screaming about where they're going to go, and the constant bombing. I suspect this is April, and that we will see an increased siege on Kiev and other cities to bring them to their knees. I have met with the Ukrainian delegation that begged us to recognize that their children were being stolen by Russians. Right now, we have a Wall Street Journal reporter as a hostage, Paul Whelan as a hostage in Russia. I fought hard for Trevor Reed and Brittany Griner, and they together are fighting for the Wall Street Journal reporter and, of course, Paul Whelan. This amendment is a common sense amendment. It indicates that with the procedures that we have, let us be merciful and understand the plight of war, the desperation that these people have who are fighting for democracy, who are using every shred of their common humanity, women and men in the armed forces, using whatever equipment they can secure just to maintain democracy. As I talk to Ukrainians who have come, they want to go home to their beautiful country. They had a beautiful, historic land. It was a democratic land. It's the kind of land that we love here in America. We flee as Americans, if we ever did, out of the chaos of war. Thank God we have not, since the Civil War, had a war on our soil. And frankly, this is a bill that I don't know what its mission is. I have no idea. I know that farmers across America are looking for workers. They want an agricultural visa. They want a process. There are ways to utilize H-1Bs. Students who are getting PhDs are leaving America because they have no legal way of becoming a citizen. The amendment that I am rising to support provides an opportunity to accept Ukrainians from this harsh structure of parole, the elimination thereof. And it says that a Ukrainian national, the spouse, a common law partner, or unmarried son or daughter under the age of 21 can come in if you're accompanying a Ukrainian national. And that this person was physically present in Ukraine as of February 11, 2022. So they were in the midst of the war. I was in Lithuania on February 24th, the year that Russia invaded Ukraine. We were there to try and see if the Russians would stand down. We're meeting with the dissidents of Ukraine. We were thinking that we had made an impact as members of Congress, but we did not. But in this amendment, the persons will undergo and pass required national security and public safety vetting. And they will be the beneficiary of they must be the beneficiary of an approved form of declaration of support, meaning they're coming to someone to take care of them. Ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues, we can be anything in opposition to a lot. But the one thing America has been known for is the humanitarian it shows to those who are fighting for democracy and fleeing the crush of democracy, which is what Russia is doing to Ukraine. I do not want to put a burden on those individuals who watch their fellow Ukrainians die in the streets, pregnant hospitals blow up, and not allow them by parole, by a legal process, to come into the United States, supported by someone who can take care of them until they can take care of themselves. And so I am here asking that we support the amendment. Again, maybe someone will articulate the mission, Mr. Chairman, of the legislation before us, because I believe we should have comprehensive immigration reform, legal immigration that can help all. I support the amendment and oppose the opposition to it and the underlying bill. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I oppose this amendment. Parole is designed very specifically to be used on a case-by-case basis for very specific purposes. To the extent that there's a debate and a discussion about how to handle our friends in Ukraine, you can do that through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. You can do that through other policies. We've got those policies. We can debate those, but you should not turn parole into what this administration has been turning it into, which is try to make it a categorical mechanism of putting people into the United States. And that's not what parole was designed for, and nor should it be. Furthermore, and with respect to the questions about the Secretary of Homeland Security, look, the Secretary of Homeland Security does in fact have a duty to take all actions determined necessary and appropriate to achieve and maintain operational control over the entire international land and maritime borders of the United States. That's statutory law. It's a requirement of the Secretary. He has not only failed to maintain operational control of the border, defined in law, as the prevention of all unlawful entries into the United States, including entries by terrorists, other unlawful aliens, instruments of terrorism, narcotics, and other contraband, but his actions have also actively facilitated the loss of it. He's an accomplice to the violation of our laws and national sovereignty by virtue of every action he has taken to empower cartels and to allow the complete decimation of our border. These laws established by Congress and ordered by the courts are being ignored to achieve a specific desired outcome not supported by the law, establishing a wide open border to issue legal status to as many illegal migrants as possible. To accomplish this objective, he has refused to spend congressionally appropriated dollars. He has disobeyed our immigration and border security laws. He has failed to prosecute cases as the law requires. He has violated court orders to carry out his duty to secure our borders. He has actively misled the American people in Congress in working to disclose the extent of the border crisis. He terminated construction of the border wall despite congressional appropriation requiring him to do so. He caused CBP to become dangerously overwhelmed and unable to execute its statutory duties by failing to utilize readily available legal tools to avert the border crisis. He lied about Border Patrol, accusing them of race-motivated whipping, which did not occur. He knew it didn't occur. He had a memo that said it didn't occur, and yet he said it anyway at the microphone. He released migrants, ignoring his duty in the law, into the interior of the United States. He refused purposely to enforce interior immigration laws and removal requirements. He's lied to the American people repeatedly and to Congress in saying the southern border was, quote, closed. He has conducted himself recklessly when willful blindness in empowering criminal drug cartels. He has impaired the health of Americans with communicable diseases and lethal drugs. He has damaged the United States' economic health, wasting the hard-earned money of taxpayers, allowed illegal migrants to destroy private property throughout South Texas and beyond and along the southern border. He has placed American citizens at imminent risk of physical harm. I could continue, but to say that the Secretary of Homeland Security has neglected his duty under the Constitution and failed to uphold his oath to defend the laws of the United States would be a dramatic understatement, to say the least.
The gentleman yield.
I would not at this point, because what the Secretary has done repeatedly and overwhelmingly has been to ignore the laws of the United States that he is required to carry out in order to defend the United States border as is required as the Secretary of Homeland Security. It's literally his job. It's what he is supposed to do. And in the process, I would note, in addition to endangering Americans as I just laid out, fentanyl crisis and other things we've discussed here, he has endangered the very migrants he says that he has been seeking to protect. By his very actions, he has endangered those migrants, resulting in, as we've talked about, 1,000 deaths along the border, resulting in scores more deaths, hundreds more deaths in the interior, resulting in the empowerment of cartels along our border. These are all facts that are irrefutable. We can debate, I suppose, the exact causes, but I believe it is a direct result of the actions of the Secretary of Homeland Security, and I think that merits debate in a future hearing in this body. I yield back to the chairman.
From California is recognized. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. This gentleman from California, and we'll get you next. Gentleman, Mr. Correa
Thank
is
you, Mr.
recognized.
Chairman. First, I want to yield a minute of my time to my colleague from Washington.
Thank you so much, Mr. Correa. I just wanted to go back to Mr. Tiffany's assertion that Ukrainians can simply seek asylum. It's just not true. There are a lot of things being said that aren't true, and I think it's important that we correct that. So if you are, you could try to be a refugee, you could go to the UNHCR, you could try to seek from the UNHCR approval to be a refugee, and then you don't necessarily know what country you're going to get placed in. In order to seek asylum, you actually have to be here at the border to seek asylum. And by virtue of having in order to be eligible for asylum, it's not enough just to be fleeing a war. And I think a war of conflict is not sufficient to be able to seek asylum. So you actually have to be able to prove that you were selected for persecution or that you fear future persecution by a government or forces beyond the government's control, or that you have been or will be targeted by the 5 protected grounds: your race, your religion, your nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Now, of course, this bill seeks to eliminate all of that anyway, so it would be very difficult to seek asylum under this bill because it eliminates all of that. But I just think it's very important that we go back to the content of this amendment, which is to ensure that Ukrainians who are fleeing the war in Ukraine and Vladimir Putin are able to be paroled in. That has been a compassionate response of the United States to the Ukrainian people, and this amendment seeks to protect that very narrow protection for Ukrainians. I yield back to my colleague.
Thank you. Just wanted to mention that I'm probably the only member of Congress that actually went to visit the Ukrainian refugee camps about a year ago. And what I found was a model of how you deal with a refugee situation. I walked into a camp set up by the Mexican government in Tijuana, Mexico. Essentially took a baseball field and set up camps, tents, brought in doctors, brought in food, then brought in a whole process where families, not just individuals, but whole families were actually being processed on a case-by-case basis. They were granted parole. They were then taken on a bus to the border. Title 42 was lifted. Pedestrian crossing west that had been closed because of COVID was open for them, and they walked right across the border. Today, if you go to Tijuana, Mexico, that refugee camp is non-existent because today, Ukrainians can fly directly from Europe to the United States under parole. If you were looking for somebody to do the right thing, which is what Secretary Mayorkas has done in dealing with the refugees, look at the Ukrainian model. And today in my district, and I think in many other districts, you have vibrant Ukrainian communities springing up, being productive members of our society, and probably waiting for the right time to return to their home. Parole, Title 42, figure it out. Let's do the right thing to make sure that refugees are respected in a humane manner. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized. Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would remind my Democratic colleagues this bill is perspective only. It doesn't affect populations already admitted into this country. So the Ukrainians already admitted are not affected by this bill. The gentlelady from Washington is absolutely correct. Asylum is set aside only for those who are being persecuted by their government for specific reasons. The Democrats have been arguing the opposite all afternoon, and I'm glad the gentlelady from Washington has decided to set them right. Asylum is not for those fleeing communism. It's not for those fleeing violence or poverty. It's not for those fleeing a war. That's not applicable to our asylum laws. In those circumstances, fleeing a war, they're refugees, and there are very different processes for that category. Asylum is for the persecuted. And what this bill means is that those seeking asylum because of persecution in the future will have their cases heard expeditiously because they won't have to wait for years while millions of fraudulent or inapplicable claims are clogging our courts. Parole is an individual executive function that is done on a case-by-case basis. Categorical parole isn't parole at all. That's a change of the law itself. And the law in our country doesn't reside in the sovereign's mouth. In 1952, Congress created the parole authority for the president for emergencies, like someone who needed to enter the country for an urgent surgery where there's no time to go through the normal channels. In 1996, because this process was being abused, Congress made it very clear that this is an individual case-by-case power only. The law says specifically parole is to be used only on a, quote, case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons of significant public benefit, end quote. This administration has been granting categorical parole not on a case-by-case basis, but to entire classes of individuals numbering in the tens of thousands. This bill simply forbids parole based on an entire class of potential parole recipients. That function is the sole prerogative of Congress, and with this measure, Congress takes that power back. If you want to modify the immigration law to exempt entire classes of immigrants, well, by God, this is the place to do it. You've been trying to do it all day today. This is the right place. This is where categorical exemptions are supposed to be considered. They are not supposed to be imposed by the whim of the executive. I yield back. Oh, I yield to Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you. I'm only going to take a few minutes. First of all, I just want to say that Congressman Chip Roy is dead on. What you just said about Mayorkas is exactly right, and it's going to save me a lot of time. But I do think it's embarrassing, just speaking to the other side, if you listen to him in hearings, he doesn't tell the truth. If you listen to him in hearings, he never gives a direct answer. If you listen to him in hearings, he's not willing to take the responsibility for all of the problems that he has caused. He has been a terrible secretary. He has let down the American people. He's let down the United States Congress. He has let down everybody in what he does. And again, we've said it before, some people, he should resign or he should be impeached, but he shouldn't be there because his presence alone has taken us more than one step back. Secondly, parole. There's a right way to do it. This bill, the bill that we want to do, does it the right way. And if we did things the right way, not the illegal way, but the right way, there would be less problems, there'd be more compassion, and actually everything would work for those that really need the help they should get. It is the same with asylum. The reasons that we're concerned about asylum is not because we're against true asylum. The reason that we're concerned with it is because that's not what we're doing. We're using it as a tool just to let anybody in. We're not doing it the right way. We're breaking the rule of law over and over and over again. And again, because of that, you can't have the compassionate response that you would want with asylum because people now identify it with something else. And you know, it's great that Mexico had everything set up so well, and I'm proud to see Mexico doing that because they certainly could help us out. And by the way, Mexico has real borders. Mexico has borders. Almost every country in the world has borders, but somehow we don't. It's just a matter of doing things by the rule of law and doing them the right way. Nobody's against all of these issues. We're against what we're doing with them and what Mayorkas is doing them. And at the end of the way, at the end of it all, kids are being used for child labor. We have sex slavery. We have people that should be on the terror watch list that don't get out. It's the wrong thing.
Gentleman's time is...
I know. I'm sorry. I'm aggravated.
You're on a roll.
I'm aggravated, Chairman.
I understand. I understand. The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California yields. Yep. The gentleman from New York is recognized, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, over 100,000 Ukrainians fleeing Vladimir Putin's unprovoked war of aggression have found temporary safety in the United States thanks to the existing United for Ukraine program. If the definition of parole under this bill were to be adopted, these Ukrainians would not have been able to enter the United States. Ukrainians fleeing from Putin generally are ineligible for asylum because of the narrow grounds for approval, and that's okay. The vast majority of Ukrainians are seeking only a temporary home and wish to return to Ukraine once it is safe to do so. The U4U program provides them with the temporary protection they need until they can return home. This amendment is simple. It adds a provision to the parole section of this bill exempting this population from the restrictions and enabling the U4U program to continue. Well, I believe that so that they don't have to be sent back to Ukraine. Well, right now. Well, I believe that the restrictions on parole authority are an unnecessary overreach into a power traditionally reserved for the executive. Since the majority refuses to meaningfully modify the language, I'm hopeful that this narrow exception to protect the Ukrainians who have fled from Vladimir Putin's war and who are here now will be acceptable to them. I urge my colleagues to accept the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald is recognized.
I would yield to the gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman from Texas.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I would only note that the gentlelady from Washington makes our case very specifically with respect to how asylum has been continually abused to allow people to get released into the United States. The gentlelady went through with precision, trying to make the case, I believe in good faith, that there are Ukrainians that would be on the outside looking in to a tightly defined asylum criteria. Asylum criteria, which is designed very specifically in our statutes to apply to individuals who seek relief because of credible fear of persecution for their religious beliefs or political beliefs primarily. And so the gentlelady laid that out fairly well and then said, therefore, we need to do something for Ukrainians. Let me put aside for the moment the do something for Ukrainians piece of the argument. I don't believe parole is the right vehicle for doing that. But we can debate that. I don't believe you should make categorical exceptions for a policy that is designed very specifically to be case by case, to deal with somebody who's sick, needs a liver transplant, whatever it might be, which is literally what parole was put in place to do. So we could go do that. We could have a debate about what do we do about our friends in Ukraine. But I think the gentlelady made a very strong case for why we need legislative correction to the abuses by the current executive, the president, allowing that very specific definition of asylum to be turned on its head to say a claim of asylum means you're released into the United States and invites a flood to the border. I would note that the ranking member, I will in a minute if I can finish, let me make my point. I'll be happy to. The ranking member earlier, I don't remember at what point, but very early in our proceeding today, used the phrase enforcement without reforms is a non-starter. Well, I understand why the gentleman might want that. The gentleman wants to have some other policies. It could be amnesty. It could be something to do with DACA. It could be something to do with, future flow. Some debates that we've had repeatedly in various forms over the last, numerous years. But it kind of gives away the whole point. Literally listen to the sentence. Enforcement of the law. That's the next phrase. Enforcement of the law. Enforcement of our laws at the border. Enforcement of our border. Without reforms is a non-starter. See, we view it through the lens, I believe, I want to speak for mine, but I view it through the lens of we're supposed to enforce the law. And everything we're doing is trying to hold the executive branch accountable to the laws passed by this body, put into law, enacted, then appropriated, and then blatantly disregarded and ignored by the executive branch.
Would the gentleman yield?
Well, I think the gentlelady asked for me to yield first, so I will defer to the gentlelady and then to the ranking member.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to be clear that we are debating parole right now. That's what the amendment is about. So I'm saying that Ukrainians are a group that should be allowed to continue parole, number one. Number two, on asylum, I don't see how I've made your case at all, because my belief is that the current asylum system requires that we allow people who are seeking asylum to go through the process to show that they either do or don't have credible fear of persecution. That requires a period of time. People, when they come in, don't have all the documents, as you know, because you do know this issue. You know that the majority of people are pro se. Unfortunately, we treat immigrants like they're criminals, but we don't give them what we give people in the criminal justice system. They don't have attorneys. They're allowed to get one if they can afford one, but they need to have time to process that. So there's nothing in what I'm saying that validates your point of view.
My time's have about 40 seconds left, which might mean I may not have time for the ranking member. But to respond there, the point about asylum, what we're saying is, of course, if you have a credible fear of persecution, we want to be able to hear that claim. But you have to adjudicate that claim. And what you cannot do is what we do, which is release people basically saying, oh, you come here, you walk around, and we know it. There's signs literally put on trees at the Rio Grande that says, asilo, arrow. And then people go, and then they say, asilo. And then, boom, you've got a flood of humanity. And then those individuals are then give a notice to appear, or totally unlawfully a notice to report that is totally ignored. And then only a fraction show up, or a percentage show up. That's debatable. We can hold hearings to get the recent data. But they don't show up, and they're released, so you're causing more flood. I'm just making the point that the gentlelady made the case that the definition of asylum is in fact narrowed. That's the point.
We've always said that. We've always said that. But we believe people should be able to prove that they have that time.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I will yield.
I thank the gentlelady. I'm going to be very brief. The quote you gave for me about enforcement without reform is a non-starter. It's quite correct. But that was talking about the whole bill, and I'm not going to debate that right now. We're talking about this specific amendment. This amendment would allow an existing program under which Ukrainians, the vast majority of whom do not seek asylum, so asylum is not in question, to be paroled into this country until it is safe for them to go back. Under the terms of this bill, without the amendment, we'd have to send them all back immediately, back to Putin's tender mercies. All this amendment does is to add I don't agree with the bill in getting rid of a lot of the parole authority anyway, but all this amendment does is say that with respect to the Ukrainian parole authority that has already been exercised, it can continue being exercised, so we don't have to send all these people back to Ukraine now. And if there are any people there who want asylum, they can apply for asylum under the normal provisions. This has nothing to do with that.
The gentlelady, give me 5 seconds to respond to him.
No, I need my time. If I have time, I will yield to you, Mr. Roy. There's just a couple things. Of course. There's a couple things I want to point out, and I point this out because I want my colleagues to understand there's a lot more to understand about immigration and migration than what we are talking about here. And I totally get why many of you are unfamiliar with what we deal with on the border. It's a lot, and immigration is super complex. One of my colleagues just said, Mexico has its borders and basically monitors its borders. You clearly have no understanding of what's happening in our hemisphere. We are seeing an unprecedented migration through the entire hemisphere, and Mexico is not able to control its own southern border right now because of the numbers. And in fact, Costa Rica, as an example, they have seen record numbers as well. So this idea that this is only a U.S. issue really demonstrates a lack of awareness of what's happening in the hemisphere. Furthermore, the use of parole is not new by this administration. And in fact, the prior administration, the Trump administration, used parole. Why? Because of the large numbers, because there was no more room in detention. How do I know that? We lived it in El Paso. Our shelters would receive migrants paroled by the Trump administration. So again, I mention this because the challenge that we face is so much greater than the very myopic view that is being expressed on this committee by the majority. This idea that one president is to blame, or one policy is to blame, or one DHS secretary is to blame, completely ignores the reality that we have been facing for a decade, which is this historic refugee crisis throughout the hemisphere. And so how do we fix it? How do we do it? We don't do it this way, in a very partisan way that seeks to do more of the same. We do it by sitting down together, looking at legal pathways. Where is it advantageous to us as Americans to have more legal migration, to have a better managed border? That doesn't get you all clicks on Twitter. That doesn't help you all fundraise, but it would help us address the issue, which is what my border community would like, which is what my Democratic colleagues and I would like. And Mr. Roy, you have the remaining 30 seconds. I'm happy to yield to you.
Well, I appreciate it. I don't even know if I'll use it all. Just to say to the ranking member that where we disagree is the use of parole is designed to be on a case-by-case basis. If we're going to have a solution with respect to Ukraine, if a solution is needed, and we have a solution with respect to Ukraine, I think it ought to be specific to that with respect to refugee law and how we deal with refugee resettlement and other mechanisms. I do not believe that's what parole was designed to do. Again, I think it's a case-by-case authority, and that's my disagreement, and I'd yield back to the gentlelady or yield back.
I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized. Ms. Scanlon.
Amendment at the desk?
Wait. No, we're
Oh, you're saying?
yeah, we're still on the
Sorry.
amendment.
Why am I recognized? I did not.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Washington.
Okay.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it.
Okay.
Roll call being asked for. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gaetz? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs?
Ready to offer my amendment
Mr.
if I need to.
Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? No. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany?
No.
Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey?
No.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew?
No.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels?
No.
Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Moore?
No.
Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman? No. Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Moran votes no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? No. Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Aye. Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar votes aye. Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes aye. Mr. Issa, you are not recorded. Mr. Issa votes no. Ms. Sparts, you are not recorded. Ms. Sparts votes no.
Have all members voted? Gentlemen,
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana, you are not recorded. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no.
gentlemen from Texas, Mr. Gooden?
Mr. Gooden votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, there are 12 ayes and 22 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Point of order. Reserve a point of order.
Gentleman from New York reserves.
Amendment to
Order.
the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. McClintock, offered by Mr. Massey of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Excuse me. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized to speak on his amendment.
I thank the chairman. My amendment is to the E-Verify portion of this immigration bill in front of us. To summarize, it says, no federal benefit may be made available to an alien whose authorization to be employed has not been confirmed under the verification